My name is Oscar Armstrong, and I am 50 years old. I have hiked the Appalachian Mountains for nearly 30 years. I have guided groups through dense forests, across rushing creeks, and up ridgelines that offer views of 7 states on a clear day. I have never broken a promise to bring my hikers home safe until the summer of 2019. The idea came from Elaine Brooks, my sister. She was 56 then, recently retired from her job as a library director in Baltimore. She wanted to gather a group of old friends and family for what she called a final adventure before the body becomes too tired to care. I should have seen the irony in that phrase. I should have recognized it as the kind of thing people say before everything falls apart. Philip Harper was with us, 75 years old, silver-haired, built like someone who refused to accept the limitations of age. He was Elaine's husband, and he had this way of smiling that made you trust him instantly. The kind of man who told jokes at the wrong moments and somehow made everyone feel better about difficult things. I would later understand that his jokes were not really jokes at all. They were warnings that nobody was listening to. Carla Grant joined our group as well. She was the youngest among us, only 32, a wildlife specialist from Virginia who studied animal behavior in protected forest areas. She had studied the Appalachian ecosystem for a decade. She understood the mountains better than any of us, or so we believed. Carla was the one who said we would be safe if we followed her route. I remember her voice when she said it, confident, not cautious. That distinction matters. Terrence Riley was our 6th member, 60 years old, a retired teacher, soft-spoken and kind. He had hiked with me before on shorter treks. He was the type of man who paid attention to details. He noticed when the bird sounds changed. He knew which plants were safe to touch. He was the reason we understood what was happening before the rest of us did. By then, understanding did not save us. Gloria Fox came along as a favor to Elaine. They had been friends since childhood, and Gloria was 70. She was smaller than the rest of us, with white hair she wore in a long braid. Gloria was the only one who brought a journal on that trip. She wrote in it every night in the tent. I read parts of it afterward. The authorities asked me to. Those words became evidence of something, though the authorities still are not certain what. We started our hike on July 8, 2019, at the Skyline Ridge trailhead near the Virginia border. The morning was clear. The weather forecast showed no storms. We carried enough food and water for 7 days. We had maps, compasses, a satellite communicator, first aid supplies, and all the optimism of people who had done this before and lived to describe it as character building. The first 3 days were exactly what Elaine had promised. We hiked between 12 and 15 miles each day. The elevation changes challenged us, but none of us had come unprepared. Philip joked about his knees. Gloria sketched the landscape in her journal. Carla pointed out wildlife evidence, teaching us how to read the forest like a book. We passed other hikers on the trail, exchanged greetings, followed the white blazes that marked the official route. On the night of the 3rd day, we camped at a place called Hollow Creek Basin. The name comes from a geological formation where 2 ridgelines curve inward toward a central valley. The forest is thick there, ancient, with trees that had been growing for longer than any of us had been alive. A creek runs through the center of the basin, and that is where we made our camp. Carla had recommended we leave the official trail here. She said the official route went around the basin, adding 6 miles and unnecessary climbing. She said the basin was stable, the creek was crossable, and we would save hours by cutting through. She showed us on the map. The land looked navigable. I deferred to her knowledge. She was the specialist. I was simply the guide who had hired on to make sure nobody got injured. That was my job. That was what Elaine paid me to do. We set up our tents in a clearing 50 yards from the creek. We cooked dinner on a camp stove. We did not build a fire. Fire leaves scars on the landscape, and Carla believed in leaving no trace. As the sun fell and the shadows deepened, the forest settled into that peculiar silence that happens when the day animals stop moving and the night creatures have not yet begun. It is not really silence. It is a specific kind of quiet where sound becomes personal, intimate, close. Terrence mentioned that he had not heard any owls all day. That was what he said, sitting by the camp stove while Gloria wrote in her journal. He had not heard owls. The absence of a sound bothered him. Philip laughed at that and said perhaps the owls had taken a vacation. Gloria looked up from her journal and told Terrence to stop being superstitious. But Terrence was not being superstitious. He was being a teacher, the kind of man who noticed when the expected thing did not occur. I remember the temperature dropping. We were in July, and it must have been 75 degrees during the day. But as the darkness came, it became cold. We put on jackets. I checked the weather one more time on the satellite communicator. The forecast remained clear. At 10 in the evening, we retired to our tents. Philip and Elaine shared one tent. Gloria had her own, the way she preferred. Carla and I shared a larger 4-person tent because we both preferred to travel light. Terrence had his own 2-person tent. We settled into our sleeping bags. The sounds of the forest continued. An animal moved through the understory somewhere distant. A tree branch fell, distant, heavy. The creek ran constantly, a white noise that could have been soothing if I had not been thinking about the way Terrence's voice sounded when he mentioned the owls. I was nearly asleep when Carla spoke. She had been silent for 20 minutes, long enough that I thought she was already unconscious. She said my name. When I answered, she said something was wrong with the sounds outside. I told her to go to sleep. I told her that hiking makes the mind alert, that we sometimes hear things in the forest that are not really there, that this was normal. She did not answer immediately. Then she said, "No, Oscar, the sounds are stopping. Everything is going quiet. The forest is going silent." I listened. She was right. The insects had stopped their chirping. The small animal movements had ceased. The creek seemed louder now, only because nothing else was producing noise. A silence had fallen across Hollow Creek Basin like a blanket being drawn up and over the landscape. I told Carla this was natural. I told her that sometimes animals pause, that the forest has rhythms we do not fully understand. I was lying to her. I was also lying to myself. Because I had hiked these mountains for 30 years, and I had never heard a silence like that before. A silence that felt like the forest was holding its breath. A silence that felt like waiting. Carla tried to sleep. I heard her breathing become deeper, slower, but I remained awake. I listened to that silence press against the walls of our tent. I watched the shapes of trees move beyond the fabric, though there was no wind to move them. At 3 in the morning, I heard something move through the clearing. Not the small movements of deer or raccoon. This was something larger, something that moved with purpose and weight. It circled our camp. I could hear it step on the dry ground, crushing leaves and fallen branches. I could hear it breathe. Long, deliberate breaths, as if it were tasting the air, sorting through the scents of 6 humans in tents. I should have done something. I should have woken Carla. I should have called out. I should have turned on my flashlight and looked outside. Instead, I remained motionless in my sleeping bag, my heart moving at a pace that felt dangerous, my breath shallow and controlled. The thing continued circling. It came close to our tent. I heard it sniff along the fabric. I heard it make a low sound in its throat, not quite a growl, something between a snort and a rumble. Then it moved away. It walked toward where Philip and Elaine slept. I heard it pause there, heard it breathe, heard it circle once before moving on to Gloria's tent. Gloria did not wake. The creature did not enter the tent, but it remained there, outside, stationary, for what must have been 5 minutes but felt like hours. Finally, it moved into the forest. The sounds of the night insects and small animals resumed gradually, as if they were carefully testing the darkness to see if it was truly safe. By 4 in the morning, the forest had returned to its normal night sounds. I did not sleep after that. I watched the sky lighten from black to deep blue to gray. I watched the dawn break across Hollow Creek Basin. When the others woke, I did not tell them what I had heard. I told myself that I was not certain what the creature had been. It could have been a bear, a large bear certainly, larger than any bear I had seen, but mountains can distort sound. A closer bear can sound closer than it is. An unfamiliar animal can sound like something from legend when you are half asleep and the forest is working its psychology on your mind. Philip was already telling jokes about Terrence's owls. Gloria showed me a sketch she had made in her journal by lamplight, a rendering of the forest as it appeared through the darkness. Carla suggested we needed to move quickly that day, that we should make good time toward the next campsite. I agreed, and we packed our camp in silence. As I was breaking down my tent, I noticed something. The ground where the creature had circled us was marked with prints, large prints, bigger than any bear track I had seen in 3 decades of hiking. The prints were not quite right. The spacing between them was wrong. The depth was wrong. The arrangement of the marks in the dirt seemed almost to suggest something with too many toes. Terrence saw them at the same time I did. Our eyes met. He had come over to help with my tent. His face had gone pale. He opened his mouth to speak, but Gloria called out that we needed to get moving, that Carla had located our best route to the next site. Terrence closed his mouth. We finished packing. The forest felt different that morning. The same trees, the same paths, but different. The green seemed darker, the shadows deeper. Every sound made my neck tense. Every movement at the edge of my vision made me turn my head. I stayed at the back of our group as we began hiking deeper into Hollow Creek Basin, following Carla's chosen route, following the creature that had already shown us its presence in the darkness. We did not know, at that moment, that what we had encountered was not leaving. The basin narrowed as we hiked deeper into it. The ridgelines on either side grew closer together, and the forest ceiling thickened until the morning light barely penetrated. We were hiking through a perpetual dusk, a lightless space where day and night seemed to blend into a constant gray dimness. Carla had assured us that the basin would open up within 3 miles, that we would climb out the far side by afternoon, that we would reach Black Rock Ridge by evening. That was what she said as we set out. I remember her voice being confident, certain, professional. I remember thinking that expertise makes people sound invulnerable when they are speaking about their area of specialization. By noon, we had hiked 4 miles, and the basin had not opened. Instead, it had become narrower, more claustrophobic. The creek we had crossed at our camp now ran beside us, growing louder and faster as we descended deeper into the valley. The forest floor was becoming wetter. The smell of rot and decay was growing stronger. The smell of leaves and bark and things that had fallen into the creek and been broken down by water and fungus. Gloria mentioned that her feet hurt. Philip said his knees were complaining. Terrence asked Carla to check the map. His tone was not accusatory, but there was something underneath it, a questioning, a suggestion that something was not aligning with the plan. Carla checked the map. She said we were exactly where we should be. She pointed to a pencil mark on the topographic lines. She said the basin would widen in approximately 2 miles. We would find a suitable place to camp by 6 in the evening. We continued. The water was getting louder. The air was becoming cold, colder than it should have been in July, colder than the temperature at our previous camp. I could see my breath beginning to form clouds in the air. I checked the satellite communicator. The temperature read 52 degrees Fahrenheit. That did not seem possible, but the device does not lie. Machines have no reason to deceive. Elaine asked if I was concerned about the temperature drop. I said that microclimates in valleys could differ significantly from surrounding areas, that elevation and water proximity created conditions that could vary wildly, that this was nothing unusual. I was still lying to myself and everyone else, because unusual was exactly what this was. A 40-degree temperature drop from the previous day, happening gradually, happening in a descent that should have heated us rather than chilled us. At 2 in the afternoon, we stopped to eat lunch. Carla had selected a flat area where the creek broadened slightly, creating a small beach of smooth stones. We sat on the rocks and opened our food packs. Nobody was particularly hungry, but we ate anyway because eating was part of the schedule, part of the plan, part of the structure that kept things feeling normal. Terrence asked if I had heard anything unusual during the night. He asked it quietly so the others would not hear. I told him I had heard the forest, and the forest makes many sounds. He nodded as if this answered a question other than the one he had asked. Carla studied the map and the landscape around us. She was comparing the two, looking for landmarks, trying to verify our location against her pencil marks. I watched her face. I watched the moment of confidence falter. I saw her eyes narrow. I saw her trace a line on the map with her finger, following it down into the valley, following it toward our destination. "We need to get moving," she said. "We are losing light earlier than expected," but we had not been hiking that long. The sun was still high in the sky, still well above the ridgeline. We had at least 4 hours of good light remaining. I said this to Carla. I asked her to clarify. She said the elevation here was lower than she expected, which meant the ridgelines blocked more light, which meant dusk would come early. The explanation was logical. It was also wrong, but it was the kind of wrong that nobody catches until later, until you have time to sit down with a calculator and a map and realize the numbers do not correspond to the geography. We finished eating quickly. We packed our trash into our bags, following the leave no trace principle, leaving no evidence that we had ever been in that place. We began hiking again, and the forest continued its gradual darkening. I began noticing something at around 3 in the afternoon. We were being watched. I could not see whatever was watching us, but I could feel it. There is a difference between feeling observed and actually being observed. Feeling observed is just the mind playing tricks, the forest playing psychological games with the human consciousness. Actually being observed is different. It has a weight to it, a pressure, a distinct sensation of being measured and evaluated. The thing moved in the trees at the edge of our vision. When I turned to look at it directly, there was only forest, only shadows, only the green and brown and gray of natural things. But when I looked away, I could sense it moving, circling, parallel to our route, keeping pace with us as we descended deeper into Hollow Creek Basin. At 3:30, Gloria's boot broke. The sole separated from the heel, and suddenly she was walking with half a shoe, limping, unable to put full weight on that foot. Carla stopped the group. She examined the boot. She said the glue had failed, that Gloria's foot must have been hot, that the heat had weakened the adhesive. Gloria had not mentioned that her foot was hot. Nobody had mentioned anything about temperature changes to their bodies, even though we were all experiencing the same shift in external conditions that would naturally warm our feet if that were actually happening. Philip asked if we needed to stop and make camp early. Carla said we were making good time and should continue. She fashioned a temporary repair using duct tape from the first aid kit, wrapping Gloria's foot and boot together until it was secure again. Gloria said it would hold. We continued. By 4 in the afternoon, the forest had become almost completely dark. Carla was using a handheld GPS unit now, checking our location repeatedly, checking the map repeatedly, cross-referencing and calculating and trying to understand why the landscape was not matching her expectations. I saw her jaw tightening, saw her shoulders becoming more rigid. "We need to stop," I said. "We need to make camp now. It is not safe to continue in this light." Carla wanted to continue. She said we were almost out of the basin. She said the open area was just ahead. She said we could make it before full darkness. Terrence backed me up. He said the light was bad, that the shadows were becoming dangerous, that we could twist an ankle or fall on the rough ground. Elaine and Philip agreed. Gloria, with her broken boot, agreed as well. Carla consented, but I could see that she did not want to. She had planned this route, and the route was not behaving as predicted. A place that was supposed to open up had not opened up. A trek that was supposed to take one day was extending into a second day. The environment was not cooperating with her expertise, and that troubled her in a way I recognized from my years as a guide. When the land starts acting differently than expected, it means there is something wrong with either your knowledge or the land itself. Neither option is comforting. We found a clearing near the creek, an area surrounded by large trees that seemed to lean inward slightly, creating a natural shelter. We set up our tents quickly, efficiently, without conversation. The temperature was now reading 48 degrees. It was dark enough that we needed headlamps, dark enough that we could not see the sky above the trees. We cooked dinner. Everyone ate more than they had eaten at lunch, but that was because we were frightened, and eating helped with the fear. Nobody discussed the fear directly. We spoke about sore feet and tired muscles. We talked about the difficulty of the terrain. We made jokes about the unpredictability of Appalachian weather. We did all the normal things people do when they are terrified, but lack any vocabulary for the terror. Gloria wrote in her journal with a headlamp. I could see her hand moving across the page quickly, writing more than she usually wrote, writing things that clearly needed to be recorded, needed to be documented. Philip sat quietly, not making jokes now, just watching the trees at the edge of the clearing, watching the spaces between the trees where we could not quite see. Elaine sat beside him and held his hand. Terrence was examining the forest floor, looking at the damp soil, looking at the moss and fungi and soft ground. He was looking for something. He found it after several minutes. He called me over and showed me a track. It was not like the tracks I had seen at the previous campsite. Those had been ambiguous, possibly explainable as a large bear or an unusual deer. This track was different. It was roughly circular, maybe 4 inches across, but it was marked with impressions that looked like claws or talons, or something that did not quite match either category. The claw marks were long, too long, extending as far from the center of the pad as the pad was wide. The spacing between the marks was irregular, as if the creature possessed more than 4 toes, but the arrangement was not symmetrical. I had never seen anything like it, not in 30 years, not in any book, not in any wildlife reference. Terrence had not seen anything like it either, but he knew what it meant. He looked at me, and I saw the fear in his eyes, the understanding that we were in the presence of something we did not have names for, something that did not fit into the neat categories that humans use to understand the natural world. "We need to leave," Terrence said quietly. "Tomorrow morning, first light, we need to climb out of this basin, not Carla's route, not any route that goes deeper. We need to climb." I agreed. I told him we would discuss it with the others in the morning. I told him to get some sleep. But neither of us slept that night. I shared a tent with Carla again, and for hours she did not move. She lay in her sleeping bag with her eyes open, staring up at the ceiling of the tent, thinking about the gap between what she had expected and what was occurring. At some point after midnight, she spoke. "I have read every reference about the Appalachian ecosystem I can find," she said. "I have mapped migration patterns. I have studied species distribution. I have studied the animals that live in these mountains for 10 years. There is nothing in the existing data that explains what we saw." "The track could be a malformation," I said. "An animal born with unusual paw structure. It happens." "Yes," she said, "it does happen, and it would explain one track. But I found 7 more as I was setting up the tents. 7 tracks in the clearing, all with the same characteristics. 7 tracks made by something that does not exist, or something that exists and does not have a classification in any wildlife database I have access to." "What do you think we should do?" I asked. She did not answer for a long time. Then she said, "I think we should have never come here." At 4 in the morning, something moved through the camp. I heard it enter the clearing. I heard it sniff at the tent where Elaine and Philip slept. I heard it move to Gloria's tent. I heard it make that low rumbling sound again, that sound between a snort and a growl, that sound that no animal I could name would make. This time it did not circle. This time it moved deliberately toward our tent. Carla was awake. I could feel her body become rigid beside me. The creature reached our tent and placed something against the fabric. I could see the shape of it even in the complete darkness, the shadow of something large pressing inward. It was making the sound again, over and over, that strange vocalization that seemed to communicate something beyond the scope of normal animal communication. It was almost like speech, not speech in the sense of human language, but speech in the sense of intention being expressed through sound. Then Terence, in his tent just a few yards away, shouted. He screamed, actually, a sound of fear and alarm so genuine and immediate that the creature outside our tent pulled away. I heard it move into the forest rapidly, crashing through branches, its heavy weight breaking vegetation, its retreat unmistakable. We emerged from the tents. Terence was standing outside his tent, shaking, his flashlight in his hand, his face pale. "It was trying to open the tent," he said. "I could hear it. It was trying to unzip it from the outside. I heard the slider moving. I heard the fabric tearing." I examined his tent. The bottom corner had claw marks, gouges in the tent material, and the zipper had indeed been manipulated. Whatever was outside had understood that the tent could be opened, had understood that we were contained within fabric and zippers, and had attempted to access us. Philip asked if we should call for help on the satellite communicator. I said I would, but I wanted to wait until morning, wanted to make sure the creature had fully retreated. I was terrified that using the communicator would bring the rescue helicopter, and the noise and light would attract that thing more intensely than it was already attracted to us. We did not sleep. We gathered all 6 of us near the camp stove, which we kept burning throughout the night. We sat close together, and we waited for the dawn. Nobody spoke about leaving the next morning, but we all understood that we would be leaving. The plan to hike through Hollow Creek Basin had changed. When the sun finally rose, we packed everything in complete silence. We worked quickly, methodically, with the focus of people who understood that we were no longer guests in this forest but prey. Carla took the lead and guided us not deeper into the basin, but toward the nearest ridgeline, toward the steep slope that would lead us out of Hollow Creek Basin. The climb was brutal. The slope was at least 40 degrees, covered in loose shale and exposed roots. 1 mile of that climb took us almost 3 hours. Gloria struggled. Her foot, even with Carla's duct tape repair, was causing her significant pain. Philip was limping, his knees protesting the extreme angle. Elaine stayed beside her husband, encouraging him, supporting him when the climb became too much. But we climbed because we understood what lived below us, because the forest below was becoming our fear, and the open sky above was becoming our only hope. We emerged from Hollow Creek Basin onto Black Rock Ridge at 11 in the morning. The slope had been so steep that the climb had disoriented us completely, and when we crested the ridge and saw the open sky and the landscape of rolling ridgelines extending in all directions, we collapsed, all 6 of us, simply sitting down on the stone and shale and loose dirt because our legs no longer possessed the capacity to continue moving. Philip was vomiting. Elaine was holding his shoulder, and her own hands were shaking badly. Gloria's foot was bleeding where the duct tape had worn through the fabric of her sock. Terrence was staring at the ridgeline behind us, back down into the basin we had just escaped, his expression fixed in a state between terror and fascination. Carla was doing calculations. She had pulled out her GPS unit and her map, and she was comparing our current location against our route, trying to understand how far we had actually traveled, trying to reconcile the geography of the map with the geography of the landscape. "We went 3 miles into the basin," she said quietly. "According to the map, at the rate we were hiking, we should have crossed it completely in 7 to 8 hours. Instead, it took us 32 hours. We climbed 400 vertical feet to reach this ridge, but our descent into the basin only accounted for 150 feet. The basin should not be that deep." I did not respond, because I understood what she was saying. I understood that the forest we had hiked into had not behaved like normal forest. The distances had been wrong, the time had been wrong, the light had been wrong, the temperature had been wrong. The animal that had followed us was not in any wildlife database anywhere in the world. I sat on the ridge and used the satellite communicator to call for help. I told the ranger station that we had experienced a medical emergency, that one of our party members had an injured foot, that we needed immediate extraction. I did not tell them about what we had seen. I did not tell them about the creature. I did not tell them about the tracks or the attempted tent penetration or the sounds that had pursued us for 2 days and 2 nights. The helicopter arrived within 2 hours. It came from a ranger station 30 miles to the north. It was a beautiful machine, loud and powerful and real, something that existed firmly in the world of human technology and infrastructure. When I saw it descending toward our location, I wanted to cry from relief. We were lifted off Black Rock Ridge in 2 trips. Carla and I went first, leaving Philip to help the others down to a flatter landing area. As we rose above the ridge and the basin fell away beneath us, I could see Hollow Creek Basin from above. I could see the way the forest seemed to curve inward toward the center, could see the creek running like a scar through the green, could see the places where the trees seemed denser, where the canopy seemed almost to have weight and depth in a way that normal forest does not possess. I looked at Carla, and she was looking down at the basin too. Our eyes met, and she shook her head slightly, a small gesture that meant she did not understand what she was seeing either, did not have an explanation for the geography that was unfolding beneath us. At the ranger station, we were checked over by medical personnel. Gloria's foot had to be examined and bandaged properly. Philip's knees were swollen and painful, but no permanent damage had occurred. The rest of us were dehydrated and exhausted and psychologically traumatized, but there were no injuries that required hospitalization. The rangers wanted to know what had happened. I told them that Carla had taken a wrong turn, that we had entered an area of the basin that was not on our planned route, that the terrain had been much more difficult than anticipated, that it had taken us longer to navigate out than we had expected. Carla did not contradict me. She simply sat and listened and said nothing. A ranger named Matthews mentioned that he had heard reports of hikers experiencing disorientation in Hollow Creek Basin before. Not often, but occasionally, groups would enter the basin and lose their sense of direction, would spend more time in the area than geography would suggest was possible, would emerge confused about exactly what route they had taken. He said it was probably a quirk of the local topography, something about the way the trees grew, the way the ridgelines curved, the way the shadows fell. He said it was not dangerous, just disorienting. I asked him if there had ever been reports of unusual animals in the basin. He said there had been some reports of large predators, probably bears, but nothing verified. He mentioned that some locals had old stories about creatures living in the deep parts of the basin. Folklore, really, nothing that wildlife management took seriously. "What kind of creatures?" I asked. He hesitated. "Well, the oldest stories talk about something called a Catawampus. Never been any physical evidence it exists, but it is part of the local mythology. Large cat-like creature, supposedly. Some people think it is a holdover from when panthers lived in the Appalachians before they were hunted to extinction. Other people think it is just folklore, a story told to explain animal attacks and disappearances that had more mundane causes." I did not ask him more about it. I did not tell him what we had seen, what tracks we had found, what sounds we had heard, because I understood, in that moment, that the creature we had encountered was not something that wildlife management or science or any official system of knowledge was equipped to handle or explain. 3 days after we were extracted from Hollow Creek Basin, Gloria was released from the ranger station with instructions to keep weight off her injured foot for 2 weeks. She returned to her apartment in Raleigh and never hiked again. I saw her once, a year later, and she had become very thin, very quiet. She still had the journal she had kept during our trip. She did not show me what she had written, but she told me she had documented everything, every strange thing, every moment when the geography did not match the map. Philip's knees never fully recovered. The damage was not permanent, but the pain never fully subsided. He and Elaine moved to Florida, where Philip could live in a warm climate and his joints would ache less. Elaine eventually told me that Philip had nightmares frequently. In the nightmares, he was always descending into a place from which the exit kept moving away, always getting farther rather than closer, no matter how much he climbed. Terrence returned to teaching, but he asked for a transfer to a school closer to his home. He did not want to drive long distances. He did not want to spend time alone in his car, where the silence might let him think about what had happened. His wife mentioned to me once that he no longer watched the news. He no longer read. He spent most of his free time sitting with other people, anywhere that was populated and safe, anywhere that was not alone and quiet. Carla left her position with the wildlife specialist program. She moved back to Baltimore where her family lived. I heard from a colleague that she was working at a museum, doing research, spending all her time in buildings surrounded by people. She stopped hiking entirely. She stopped doing any work in the field. She became an indoor person, someone who could not bear the idea of returning to wild places. Elaine wrote to me several times. She wanted to understand what had happened. She wanted a logical explanation that would allow her to process the experience, to file it away in her mind as something that made sense, something that could be discussed rationally. I could not give her that explanation because no such explanation exists. 4 years after the hike, I was contacted by a researcher from the University of North Carolina. She was studying regional folklore and animal behavior patterns. She had heard about our incident from someone who had worked at the ranger station. She asked if I would speak with her about what happened in Hollow Creek Basin. I agreed to an interview. The researcher brought books about Appalachian cryptids and folklore. She showed me illustrations of the Catawampus from historical sources, drawings made by people who claimed to have encountered it. The drawings showed a creature that was part mountain lion, part something else, something that did not conform to normal categories of animal classification. The creature in the drawings had a peculiar structure to its limbs, a wrong angle to its joints, proportions that made the animal seem both familiar and deeply alien. There are stories going back 300 years, the researcher told me. Reports from settlers, from indigenous peoples before them, of an animal that lives in deep mountain basins, that is attracted to groups of people traveling together, that seems to possess intelligence beyond normal animal behavior. The stories say it preys on people who wander from established trails, people who venture into places not meant for human settlement. I asked her if she believed the stories were true. She said she did not know. She said that folklore and facts are often intertwined in ways that make them difficult to separate. She said that just because something is not recognized by science does not mean it does not exist. It simply means it has not yet been measured or classified or placed into the existing system of categories that humans use to understand reality. I asked her why the creature had allowed us to escape. It had the opportunity to enter our tents. It had the capacity to kill us. Instead, it had simply made its presence known and allowed us to flee. The old stories have different explanations, the researcher said. Some say the creature is curious about humans but not predatory, that it is simply territorial and will defend its space against intrusion. Some say it is a test, that the creature allows people to discover its presence but only hunts those who become lost, those who cannot find their way back out. Some say it is punishment for desecrating the forest, that people who do not respect the land are the ones who do not return. I have spent 4 years since that conversation thinking about what she said. I have thought about the fact that we were led into the basin by someone we trusted, someone with expertise, someone who had insisted we leave the marked trail. I have thought about the temperature drop, the time distortion, the way geography seemed to work differently inside the basin than it should have worked outside it. Most of all, I have thought about the moment when Terrence screamed. That moment, more than anything else, determined our survival. If he had not made that sound, if he had remained silent, the creature would have succeeded in opening the tent. We would have had no defense against it. We would have become lost in that basin forever, or something close enough to forever that it would not matter. I have not hiked again since that summer. I have returned to the ranger station, but only to do paperwork and administrative work. I have not set foot on any trail. I have not entered the forest in any capacity that involves venturing away from roads and civilization. Sometimes, at night, I hear sounds that remind me of the sounds we heard in Hollow Creek Basin. The sounds of something moving through the darkness, something breathing, something that is just beyond the reach of light and explanation. When I hear those sounds, I understand that I was right. I was right not to tell the authorities the truth. I was right not to provide evidence or documentation or any legitimate record of what we encountered. Because if I had done those things, if I had officially documented an unknown creature in the Appalachian Mountains, it would have brought attention to that place. It would have brought scientists and researchers and people with cameras and specimens and tools designed to measure and classify and capture. It would have brought chaos to a place that for 300 years has maintained a certain equilibrium, a certain understanding between the humans who cross it and the thing that lives within it. I made a choice, standing on Black Rock Ridge as the helicopter descended to rescue us, to allow Hollow Creek Basin to remain as it had always been. Unknown, unverified, hidden away in the gaps between the official maps and the real topography of the mountains. I chose to protect the secret of that place, the way secrets are protected, by refusing to acknowledge it, by letting it be explained away as disorientation and terrain difficulty and the simple human tendency to lose perspective in wild places. Terrence understood. When he shouted that night, he was warning the creature away. He was doing what you do when you encounter something that should not be understood or classified or captured. You acknowledge its presence, you show your respect, you make it clear that you are leaving, and you retreat. We all retreated after that. We all left Hollow Creek Basin and never returned. We all learned the same lesson that the basin had been trying to teach us all along. Some places are not meant for human intrusion. Some creatures are not meant for human understanding. Some darkness is not meant to be illuminated by the light of science or documentation or official record. The Catawampus still lives in Hollow Creek Basin. I am certain of that. It still waits in the green darkness, still moves through the spaces between the trees, still watches the trails and the clearings and the places where groups of people begin their descent into territory that does not belong to them. And sometimes when I hear reports on the news of hikers missing in the Appalachian Mountains, of people who ventured off the marked trails and were never found, of groups who entered the wilderness and emerged with fragmented memories and stories that made no sense, I know exactly where those people are. They are still in that basin, or something like it, lost in the space between the map and the territory, lost in the space where the Catawampus does its careful, deliberate work. I am Oscar Armstrong, and I have hiked the Appalachian Mountains for 30 years. The most important lesson I learned was not about survival, or preparation, or respecting the wilderness. The most important lesson I learned was that there are places where human knowledge ends, and something older and darker and more patient begins. And if you are very lucky, very quiet, and very respectful, you might survive crossing that boundary. The question is whether you want to survive with the knowledge of what lives there, or whether it would have been better never to know at all. I have spent 4 years living with that knowledge, and I can tell you that I do not have an answer to that question. I do not think an answer exists. What I know is this: the forest is not what we believe it to be. The mountains contain more than what the maps show. And the creatures that live in those places are watching, always watching, waiting for the next group of people to venture into places they do not belong. When that happens, I hope they are fortunate enough to have a Terrence Riley in their party, someone who understands the value of making noise at exactly the right moment, because the silence that follows the noise is the only thing that will save your life when you are deep in Hollow Creek Basin and the Catawampus has begun its patient evaluation of your value as prey. I never thought a weekend in the Appalachian Mountains would become the thing that still wakes me up at 3 in the morning, drenched in sweat, listening to the darkness outside my bedroom window. My name is Brett Carpenter. I am a wilderness guide and park ranger for the Appalachian National Forest Service, and what I am about to tell you happened during what should have been a routine summer excursion into the most beautiful and most dangerous terrain I have ever known. It started on a Friday morning in July. The kind of morning where the mist hangs between the trees like breath frozen in time. I received a call from Vanessa Rice, an experienced hiker who had booked a guided tour through the high country for her group. 5 people total. She had done this before, or so she said. She had hiked sections of the Appalachian Trail. She had camped in places most people would never dare venture. But the mountains have a way of humbling everyone eventually. The group assembled at the base camp near Asheville. I remember the smell of that morning, clean, pure, innocent. Vanessa was there with her friend Jenna Long, a younger woman who looked nervous but determined. Then there was Curtis Patterson and Peggy Bryant, an older couple who reminded me of my grandparents. And finally, Howard Powell, a man of 72 who moved like someone half his age, with sharp eyes that seemed to see everything and understand very little. We had planned a 3-day trek into the high wilderness. The route would take us through Devil's Creek Canyon, across the ridgeline at the summit of Blackcomb Mountain, and down through the old logging trails that cut through the densest part of the forest. On paper, it looked perfect. Moderate difficulty, stunning views, a chance to see the real Appalachians, untouched and wild. I should have seen the signs that morning. Small things. The birds had gone quiet. The squirrels that usually chattered in the early hours were nowhere to be found. Even the insects seemed muted, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. But I told myself it was just my imagination. Rangers spend too much time alone in wild places. We start to see patterns that aren't there. We create stories to fill the silence. We set out at 8 o'clock, our packs heavy with supplies, 4 days' worth of food, water purification tablets, maps, rope, first aid kits, all the things that are supposed to keep you alive in the wilderness. All the things that meant absolutely nothing when the real danger began. The first day was beautiful, almost too beautiful. The trail wound through dense forest where the trees were so old and so tall that the sunlight only reached us in scattered pieces, creating patterns on the ground like stained glass. Curtis kept pointing things out to Peggy, acting like a schoolboy on his first adventure. Jenna stayed close to Vanessa, asking constant questions about the geology of the mountains, the history of the area, the wildlife we might encounter. Howard walked at the back of our group, which bothered me even then. He had insisted on it, said he wanted to watch the trail behind us, make sure no one got lost. Now I wonder if he knew something the rest of us didn't. Now I wonder if he was keeping watch for something other than stragglers. We made camp that night at Miller's Gap, a clearing surrounded by the kind of ancient forest that makes you understand how small humans really are. As the sun set, the trees seemed to grow taller, the shadows became deeper. I set up the tents while Vanessa organized the food, and Jenna gathered firewood from the fallen branches that lay scattered everywhere. It was while we were gathering wood that I first heard it. A sound that came from somewhere in the darkness beyond our camp, a low growl that seemed to vibrate through my chest. I told myself it was a bear. We had bears in these mountains, though attacks were rare. I told the group what I always tell tourists in this situation. Stay calm, make noise, back away slowly. Bears don't want trouble. But it didn't sound like a bear. I had heard bears before. This was something else. Something that made Curtis reach for Peggy's hand. Something that made Jenna move closer to the fire. Howard just nodded, as if this was exactly what he had been expecting. The sound didn't come again that night. We sat around the fire, eating the freeze-dried meals I had packed, drinking coffee from metal cups, and listening to the forest settle into darkness. Vanessa asked me about the local legends, the things the people in the nearby towns whispered about. I told her there were always stories. Mountain people created them to explain the unexplainable, to give names to the fear that lives in wild places. She didn't look satisfied with that answer. Around midnight, as the fire burned down to embers, I heard it again, that growl. Closer this time, much closer. But when I stepped away from the camp, flashlight sweeping through the darkness, there was nothing there. No eyes catching the beam, no sound of retreating footsteps, just the immense silence of the mountain forest, broken only by the occasional snap of a distant branch. I told everyone it was probably just a coyote. We have those too, smaller than bears, less dangerous, more likely to avoid humans. I don't think anyone believed me. I certainly didn't believe myself. We slept fitfully that night. I could hear the sounds of people tossing in their sleeping bags, waking at every noise. The forest is never truly silent at night. There are sounds of small animals moving through the underbrush, the creak of branches swaying in the wind, the rustle of nocturnal creatures going about their business. But there was something else that night, something that made those normal sounds seem insignificant, the way a candle flame looks insignificant when you're standing in front of a massive fire. The second day started badly. Peggy was sick, not dramatically ill, but visibly unwell. She complained of a headache and dizziness. Her skin had a grayish pallor that made me think about altitude sickness, even though we had only climbed about 2,000 feet. Curtis wanted to turn back immediately, but Vanessa insisted that rest and hydration would help. She had done this route before, she said. The altitude affected everyone differently. Peggy just needed time to acclimate, so we continued on the trail, but at a slower pace. Peggy rode on Curtis's arm, and he matched her step for step, never complaining, never suggesting again that we turn back. They had been married for 51 years, according to something Jenna mentioned. That kind of love makes people do things they probably shouldn't. It was around midday when I noticed Howard was taking photographs. Nothing unusual about that. Lots of people bring cameras into the wilderness. But Howard wasn't taking pictures of the scenery. He was photographing the ground. Fallen trees, torn bark on tree trunks, claw marks that looked fresh, disturbed earth where something large had been moving through the brush. I asked him what he was doing. He didn't answer immediately. He just looked up from his camera and smiled. It was not a comforting smile. "Just documenting," he said finally, "in case anyone asks questions later." That was the moment I knew something was very wrong. That was the moment my instincts, which I had been trying to suppress since we heard that first growl, suddenly went on high alert. We reached the ridge trail in the afternoon. This section of the hike takes you along a narrow path that runs the spine of the mountain. On both sides, the world drops away into valleys so deep you can barely see the bottom. On a clear day, which this was, you can see for miles. The view is spectacular, the kind of view that makes people understand why pioneers climbed these mountains and stayed, despite the danger, despite the isolation. But that day the view felt wrong. From the ridge you could see smoke, not just one plume, but several, rising from different parts of the forest. Wildfires, maybe, or controlled burns. But Vanessa checked her phone, the one place in the mountains where you could sometimes get a signal, and she found no alerts about fires in the area. Howard said the smoke wasn't from fires. When Jenna asked him what else it could be from, he didn't answer. He just kept walking, moving along the ridge with a determined pace, as if he knew exactly where we were going and exactly how long it would take to get there. We made camp that night at Eagle's Rest, a place where the old logging roads converged into a large clearing that had been used as a base camp by timber companies decades ago. The structures were long gone, but the ground still bore the scars. Raw earth where equipment had been parked, rusted nails and metal fragments scattered through the grass. And something else, something that I couldn't quite identify at first. Bones, small bones, the kind that might have belonged to rabbits or deer. But there were so many of them, scattered across the clearing as if something had been eating here for a very long time. Curtis saw them at the same time I did. He knelt down and examined one, turning it over in his weathered hands. When he looked up at me, his face was pale. "This is wrong," he said. "This isn't natural. Nothing dies like this." He was right. In the wild you find bones, sure, but they're scattered and weathered. These bones looked fresh, and they were arranged, almost deliberately, in a pattern that suggested purpose rather than accident. Peggy had finally sat down on a rock, her energy completely depleted. She looked like she was about to cry, but she held it together. I remember thinking that people like that, people with that kind of strength, were dangerous to have around in a crisis. They would push themselves far beyond what was safe, and they would expect others to do the same. Vanessa was studying the clearing with the intensity of someone solving a puzzle. Jenna had moved closer to me, and I realized she was scared. Genuinely scared. Up until that moment, I had been the one who was frightened. I had been the experienced one who was starting to doubt his expertise. Now I saw fear mirrored in someone else's eyes, and it made everything worse somehow. "We should leave," Jenna said quietly. "We should leave right now and go back down the mountain." I wanted to agree with her. Every instinct I had was screaming the same thing. But as the guide, as the one who had accepted payment to bring these people into the wilderness safely, I had to maintain the appearance of control. I had to pretend that I understood what was happening. I had to lie. "It's getting dark," I said. "We'll camp here tonight, and in the morning we'll assess the situation. The bones could be from anything, and the smoke is probably from forestry management. There's no reason to panic." But even as I was saying these things, I was thinking about that sound we had heard the night before, that low growl that seemed to come from something huge and hungry. I was thinking about the claw marks on the trees that Howard had photographed. I was thinking about Peggy's sickness and Howard's strange behavior and the bones scattered across the clearing. I was thinking about the stories that the old people in the towns below the mountains told. Stories that I had always dismissed as folklore and superstition. Stories about something that lived in the high country. Something that the Cherokee called by a name that translated to devil dog. Something that was supposed to have died out generations ago. Howard sat by the fire that night and told us a story. He said he had hiked these mountains as a young man, back in the 1970s. He had been part of a group, much like ours, on a trip into the high wilderness. A similar route, a similar time of year, and like us, they had heard sounds in the night. Like us, they had found evidence of something large moving through the forest. Unlike us, one member of their group had not come back down the mountain. His name had been Daniel Foster. He was only 19 years old. He had wandered away from the camp during the night, claiming he was going to get water. They found his campsite in the morning. They found his gear. They found one of his boots and part of his jacket. But they never found Daniel. "We left that same day," Howard said, staring into the fire. "Packed everything and hiked out as fast as we could. We told the rangers there had been an accident. We told them Daniel had fallen into a crevasse or gotten lost in the darkness. We didn't mention the sounds. We didn't mention the tracks we had seen. We didn't mention the fact that whatever took him, whatever was hunting us, had come to our campfire in the night and dragged one of us away." "Why are you telling us this?" Vanessa's voice was sharp, accusatory. "Because," Howard said, looking directly at me, "I think we need to talk about what we're really dealing with here." I wanted to dismiss his story as the ravings of an old man. I wanted to convince everyone that he was confused, or that he was deliberately trying to frighten us as some kind of sick joke. But I had already seen the evidence. I had already heard the sounds. And deep in my bones, in that part of me that exists outside of rational thought, I knew that everything he was saying was true. That was the moment when I realized what we were really doing here. That was the moment when I understood that this hike was no longer just a wilderness excursion. It had become something else. A test, maybe, or a trap. I looked at Howard, really looked at him, and I saw something in his expression that I should have noticed earlier. He wasn't afraid, not like we were. He was calm, purposeful, and his eyes held the look of someone who had come back to a place from his past. Someone who had been carrying a weight for a very long time and had decided to set it down, consequences be damned. It was then, as the fire crackled and the forest pressed in around us from all sides, that I first began to wonder if Howard Powell had brought us up here on purpose. If this whole expedition was something more sinister than a simple guide service. If perhaps, in some way I couldn't yet articulate, we were not the hunters in this situation at all. We were bait. The night of the second day started normally enough. We had posted a watch system, though after Howard's story, I don't think anyone was particularly confident that taking turns standing guard would actually help if something truly wanted to come into our camp. But we did it anyway, because doing something felt better than doing nothing, even if that something was ultimately futile. I took the first watch from 10 o'clock to midnight. I sat by the dying fire with a flashlight and a knife, which I knew was basically useless for anything large enough to worry about. Around 11, I heard movement in the forest surrounding our camp, not the small movements of normal wildlife. These were deliberate, purposeful. Something was circling us, moving parallel to our position, staying just beyond the range of my flashlight. At one point I heard it breathing, deep, rhythmic breathing that sounded almost mechanical in its steadiness. Slow in-breaths, slow out-breaths. Something so large that its respiration was audible from 50 yards away. When Jenna came to take her watch at midnight, she found me standing exactly where I had been for the past 2 hours, staring into the darkness, unable to move or speak. She had to take the flashlight from my hand because I wouldn't release it. "Did you see something?" she whispered. I couldn't answer her. I went back to my tent and lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the sounds of the forest. The circling continued all night. Round and round our camp, never attacking, never coming too close, but never leaving either. It was like being surrounded by a predator that was content, for now, to remind us of its presence. No one slept that night, not really. In the morning, when we emerged from our tents, we all looked like variations of the same person, pale, exhausted, haunted by something we couldn't quite process. And that was when Curtis found the message. It was carved into one of the trees at the edge of the clearing. Rough letters, gouged deep into the bark. It read only one word, "Leave." Curtis pointed it out without speaking. We all gathered around it, staring at those 5 letters as if they might suddenly rearrange themselves and reveal some new meaning. "That's not an animal message," Jenna said, her voice shaking. "That's, someone did this, someone human, but no one had done it, not during the night, not while we were all awake and watching. I was certain of that. Whatever had come to our camp and made that sound, whatever had circled us for hours, had done this, which meant that the thing hunting us was intelligent enough to communicate. That opened up new territory in my fear, a whole new landscape of dread that I wasn't prepared to explore. We should have left that morning. We should have packed up everything and run down the mountain as fast as our legs could carry us. But Peggy was worse, much worse. The color had completely drained from her face, and she could barely walk. Curtis wanted to stay, to help her recover, and Vanessa, stubbornly, insistently, wanted to continue to the final destination. She said that hiking out would be harder on Peggy than hiking forward. She said we were already halfway there. She said that the safest place for all of us was to stick to the original plan. I think she was wrong, but I don't think she was lying. I think she genuinely believed what she was saying. I think she was the kind of person who believed that nothing would actually happen to her because she was competent and prepared and experienced. The mountains are full of people like that. People who have hiked dozens of times and never encountered anything worse than bad weather. People who think that their experience is enough protection. It isn't. I know that now. So we continued. On the third day, we left Eagle's Rest and took the lower trail that would lead us through the densest part of the forest. The canopy here was so thick that even in the middle of the day, the light seemed to come from twilight rather than sun. The trail was overgrown in places, blocked by fallen trees that we had to climb over or navigate around. Peggy could barely walk. Curtis supported her completely, nearly carrying her through the rough sections. Jenna stayed close to me. Howard led the group, which I found incredibly unsettling, as if he had somehow taken command of the expedition without anyone explicitly choosing to give it to him. Vanessa brought up the rear, constantly checking her phone for a signal, constantly consulting her maps, constantly trying to reassure herself that we knew exactly where we were. But we didn't know where we were. Not really. The forest around us all looked the same. The trail markers that I had relied on seemed to have disappeared or become confused. Twice I would have sworn we were going in circles, returning to places we had already passed, but that wasn't possible. The terrain was constantly changing, or maybe I was just losing my mind. It was mid-afternoon when we found the cabin. It shouldn't have been there. There were no cabins on this route, no structures of any kind, according to the maps. But there it was, standing in a small clearing that shouldn't have existed either. Old, weathered, built from logs that had long since grayed with age. Howard stopped when he saw it and turned to look at me. There was no surprise on his face, just a grim kind of acceptance. "How long has this been here?" Vanessa asked, looking at her map. "A long time," Howard said. "Longer than the maps." We approached it slowly. The door was missing. Through the empty frame, I could see the interior was dark and empty, or at least appeared to be. The roof had holes in it where the wood had rotted through. One window still had glass, though it was so dirty that you couldn't see through it. Jenna didn't want to go inside. She pulled at my sleeve and asked me to suggest that we bypass the cabin and continue on the trail. But Vanessa was already peering into the darkness, and Curtis and Peggy were slowly approaching the structure. That was when I noticed them. Claw marks on every side of the cabin, deep gouges in the wood, as if something had been trying to get in, or trying to get out, and there was a smell. I realized it then, though I think I had been noticing it for the last mile or so of our hike. A smell like rotting meat, like something dead left out in the heat for too long. "We need to go," I said to Vanessa. "Right now, we're leaving." But it was too late. Curtis had gotten distracted helping Peggy, and Howard was standing directly in front of the cabin entrance, blocking the path forward. And Jenna, having wandered a few meters away from our group to look at something on the ground, suddenly screamed. When I reached her, she was pointing at the forest floor. A skull. Human, I thought, though it was hard to be certain. And scattered around it, bones in various states of preservation. Some relatively fresh, some so old they had started to crumble into powder. "How many?" Vanessa asked, her voice completely flat. I didn't count them. I didn't want to know the answer. But if I had to guess, I would have said at least a dozen, maybe more. Bodies had been left here. Bodies had been left in this place for a very long time. "We need to call for help," Jenna said. "We need to call someone right now." Vanessa pulled out her phone. No signal. Of course there was no signal. She tried again. Then again. Her hands were shaking. "The ranger station," Curtis said. "How far to the ranger station?" I checked the map. The nearest station was about 8 miles to the east. 8 miles through terrain that was becoming increasingly difficult to navigate. 8 miles with Peggy barely able to walk and night coming on fast. "We might not make it," I said. "Then we don't make it," Vanessa said. "We start walking, and we walk until we either reach help or the sun comes up or something else happens. But we don't stay here." So we left the cabin and the bones behind and continued on the trail. Or we tried to continue. But within an hour I realized that I had completely lost our location. The trail had become so overgrown that I couldn't find the markers. The landscape was becoming increasingly unfamiliar. We were lost. Actually, that's not quite true. I think we were exactly where Howard had planned for us to be. I think we had been lost since the moment we arrived at the clearing with the bones. Everything that had happened since then had been carefully orchestrated to move us progressively deeper into the territory of the thing that hunted these mountains. It was getting dark, truly dark, the kind of darkness that only exists in deep forests when the canopy is thick enough to blot out even the stars. And that was when I heard it again, that low growl. But this time it wasn't distant, it was close, very close. Multiple growls, actually, coming from different directions. More than one, I thought. Or maybe the same creature moving around us, creating the illusion of multiple hunters. "Everybody together," I said, and we huddled closer, forming a circle so that we could see in all directions at once. That's when Howard did something that I still can't fully process in my mind. He stepped away from the group, walked out into the darkness, toward the sound. "Howard," Vanessa called after him. "Howard, come back." But he didn't come back. He just walked into the black, and we heard him speaking in a calm voice, though we couldn't make out the words. He was speaking to it, speaking to the thing that was hunting us, as if he knew it, as if he had some kind of understanding with it. We heard his scream last, just a brief one. Then silence, then all hell broke loose. That's the part that's hardest to describe, the part that happens after the rules of the world you know stop applying. Curtis grabbed Peggy and pulled her close, sheltering her as much as he could with his own body. Jenna grabbed my hand so tightly that I thought she might break the bones in my fingers. Vanessa didn't move. She just stood there, staring in the direction where Howard had gone, as if she was trying to process what she had just witnessed. The forest erupted with sound and movement, branches crashing, the sound of something large moving through the underbrush at high speed. Not toward us, away from us, I thought, following after Howard into the black. "Run," I said. "We need to run." We didn't know which direction was which. We didn't have the trail anymore, if we ever really had it. But we ran anyway, following whatever path seemed least likely to lead us directly into a ravine. Behind us I could hear it. The sounds were getting further away, which terrified me more than if they were getting closer. Because if it was hunting Howard, if it was occupied with something else, then its attention wasn't on us. And that meant it was hunting on purpose. That meant it had choices. That meant the thing we were running from wasn't just following instinct. It was thinking. It was strategizing. We ran for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. The human brain doesn't measure time well under extreme stress. It stretches and compresses simultaneously, so that you lose all sense of how long things actually take. Eventually, we stumbled into a ravine. There was a stream at the bottom, and we splashed through it without thinking, pulling ourselves up the other side and collapsing against a boulder. Nobody spoke. We were all breathing too hard, all trying to process what we had just seen. After a while, Peggy started crying. Not loud sobs, but quiet, shaking tears that seemed to come from a place beyond grief. Curtis held her and didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. "What was that?" Jenna kept asking. "What was that? What was that thing?" I didn't answer because I didn't know, or I thought I didn't know. But deep down in that part of my mind that I had been trying to suppress, I knew exactly what it was. I had always known, from the moment I heard that first growl on our first night. I had just been refusing to acknowledge it. Vanessa was looking at me with an expression that was difficult to read. It might have been accusation. It might have been understanding. It was getting darker, and I couldn't see her face clearly enough to know. "You brought us here," she said. It wasn't a question. "No," I said. "Howard brought us here. Howard orchestrated this whole thing." "But you knew," Curtis said. His voice was heavy with something. Not quite anger, but close. "You knew something was wrong, and you didn't stop us." He was right. I had known, or I had suspected anyway. And I had let professional protocol override my instincts. I had let the fact that I was the guide, the expert, the one responsible for their safety, make me doubt my own fear. "We need to find the ranger station," Vanessa said. "We need to get out of here. We need to find shelter," I said. "It's getting dark, and we're lost. Moving around in this terrain at night is a death sentence. Staying in the same place is exactly how people die in the wilderness," Vanessa said. But she was already exhausted. We all were. And Peggy was barely conscious, her body running on pure willpower and fear and the comfort of Curtis's presence. We couldn't move, not effectively. Not anymore. I found a place where a large boulder jutted out enough to provide some protection from the sky. We huddled underneath it, and I did my best to make it look like a camp. I arranged our packs in a defensive perimeter, though I knew that whatever was out there wouldn't be stopped by backpacks and rope. We didn't have a fire. There were no matches in my pack that hadn't gotten wet during our run through the stream, and I wasn't sure we wanted a fire anyway. Fire would make us visible. Fire would draw attention. So we sat in darkness, listening to the sounds of the forest. There was nothing hunting us anymore, at least not actively. But the night was full of sounds, and every one of them sent a spike of adrenaline through my nervous system. "Tell me about the devil dog," Vanessa said at some point. It was hard to know how much time had passed. Minutes, hours. The darkness made time meaningless. "It's local folklore," I said. "Native American mythology. The Cherokee called it something that translates to the Black Devil. There are stories going back centuries. A creature that lives in the high country, preys on humans. It's supposed to be able to track you over any distance. Supposed to be able to reason and plan. Supposed to be intelligent. Supposed to be extinct," Vanessa said. "Yeah, that too. But it's not extinct," Jenna said. "It's not extinct, and Howard knew it, and he brought us here anyway." "Why would he do that?" Curtis asked. "Why would anyone deliberately lead people into danger?" I thought about the photographs Howard had taken, the claw marks on the trees, the way he had known exactly where to find the cabin, the way he had spoken into the darkness, and it had been clear that there was some kind of understanding between them. "He was trying to stop it," I said, and the moment the words left my mouth, I knew they were true. He lost someone, a long time ago, someone he cared about, and he spent his whole life trying to figure out what took that person, trying to prove it was real, trying to get someone else to see what he has seen. "By leading us to it?" Vanessa's voice was sharp. "That's not how you stop something. That's how you feed it." Maybe he thought that if enough people knew, if enough people witnessed it, someone would believe, someone would take it seriously, someone would do something about it. "And what would that be?" Curtis asked. "What does anyone do about something like that?" Nobody had an answer to that question. We passed the night in silence, broken only by the sounds of the forest and the occasional quiet sobbing from Peggy. Around what I guessed was 3 in the morning, I heard something that made my blood freeze. Singing. Not music exactly, more like a crooning sound. Low and rhythmic, with a quality that was almost musical, but also deeply wrong. It came from somewhere in the darkness, and it seemed to move around us in a circle. "Is that it?" Jenna whispered. I didn't answer because I didn't know what else it could be. The crooning continued for what felt like an hour but was probably only a few minutes. Then it slowly faded, moving away from us, going back into the deep forest. After it stopped, the silence seemed even deeper than before. "We're leaving at first light," Vanessa said. "We're finding that ranger station, and we're leaving this mountain." "With Peggy in this condition?" Curtis asked. "With or without her, yes. Because if we stay, we're going to die. All of us. That's not a guess. That's not speculation. That's just reality." She was right. We all knew it. As the first hints of gray light began to seep into the eastern sky, we packed up what little we had and started moving. I tried to navigate using the position of the sun and my general sense of the landscape, but I was completely disoriented. I had been a ranger in these mountains for 15 years, and I had never felt so lost. Peggy was worse. If anything, she was getting sicker. The color in her face was completely gone now, and her movements were mechanical, like she was being controlled by strings. Curtis supported her completely, nearly carrying her, and I didn't know how much longer he would be able to keep that up. We walked for hours. The terrain became increasingly difficult. Steep ravines, dense underbrush that seemed to deliberately impede our progress, rock formations that twisted our sense of direction, and then we found the ruins. Not the cabin we had seen before, but something older. Much older. Stone foundations laid out in a pattern that suggested a settlement, not a recent one. The stones were worn smooth by centuries of weather. Vines had grown over them, and in places, they had sunk partially into the earth. "What is this?" Jenna asked. "I don't know," I said. "It shouldn't be here." But it was. And as we walked deeper into the ruins, we found more signs of habitation, broken pottery, the remains of what might have been tools, and bones. Always bones. In one place, we found what looked like a mass grave. A depression in the earth where the ground had been disturbed repeatedly, where countless bodies had been layered and buried. Some of the skeletons were still visible, partially exposed to the air, bleached white by decades or centuries of sun exposure. "How many people died here?" Curtis asked. I didn't answer because I didn't want to know. It was Vanessa who figured it out. She knelt beside one of the skeletons and examined it closely, the way someone might examine a puzzle they were determined to solve. This is old, she said. Really old, not recent. These people died a long time ago. How long? I asked. She pointed at the pottery fragments, at the style of what looked like arrowheads scattered around the site. Hundreds of years, maybe more. This could be an old settlement site, from before European contact. She looked up at me with an expression that was equal parts revelation and dread. They were here before us, she said. The thing we're running from. It's been hunting in these mountains for longer than there have been people here to hunt. Longer than there have been rangers and hikers and tourists taking walks through the wilderness. It predates everything. That's when Peggy collapsed. She went down suddenly, her legs simply giving out beneath her. Curtis caught her before she hit the ground, but he couldn't hold her up anymore. He lowered her gently to the earth next to one of the ancient graves. I can't go any further, Peggy said. Her voice was barely a whisper. I'm too sick. I'm too tired. I can't do this anymore. Curtis knelt beside her, and I saw the moment when he made his choice. The moment when he decided that his wife was more important than survival. He held her hand and told her it was going to be okay, that they would rest here and then continue. But we all knew what he was really saying. We all knew that he had decided to stay. Take her and go, he said to the rest of us. Find help. Get out of here. We're not leaving you, Vanessa said. You are, Curtis said. Because I'm not leaving her, and if you stay with us, then all of us die here. Better to have some of us survive. So we left them. That's the part I still can't forgive myself for. We left Curtis and Peggy in that ancient graveyard and kept walking, but we didn't go far. Jenna started complaining of the same symptoms that had afflicted Peggy. Dizziness, headache, a general malaise that seemed to be spreading through her body like poison. What's happening to us? She asked. I thought about the bones in the cabins and the ruins. I thought about the mass graves we had seen. I thought about Howard walking into the darkness and his brief scream. I thought about all the hikers who had come up here over the years and never came back down. I don't know, I said. But I was starting to wonder if Peggy's sickness wasn't a random ailment at all. I was starting to wonder if it was the mountain itself, if the thing we were running from had some way of marking its prey. We found the ranger station late that afternoon. Or rather, we found what was left of it. A small wooden structure that hadn't been used in probably a decade. Inside, everything was covered with dust and cobwebs. There was a radio, but it was ancient and probably didn't work. There was also a log, a handwritten journal where rangers had recorded their activities over the years. I flipped through the pages, expecting to find routine observations, trail conditions, weather reports, animal sightings. But the more recent entries were different. Scratched notes about strange sounds, reports of missing hikers, concerns about wildlife that didn't match any known species in the area. And then, towards the end, an entry dated about 5 years prior. I've been a ranger in these mountains for 30 years, it read, and I've come to believe that there is something here that should not be disturbed. The old stories are true. The thing they call devil dog, or the black devil, whatever name you want to use, it exists. I have seen signs of it. I have heard it, and I have come to the conclusion that the only way to keep people safe is to close off the high country trails. I am submitting my official report today to recommend that access to these areas be restricted due to unstable geology and dangerous wildlife. I hope someone listens. I hope they close this place before more people die. It was signed by a ranger named Thomas Wheeler. The entry was dated 5 years ago. No further entries followed. The log ended there. Did they close the trails? Jenna asked. No, Vanessa said. She was looking at a map on the wall. The high country routes are still listed as accessible. Still have permits available. We found supplies in the ranger station. Water, some canned food. More importantly, we found a working satellite phone. Vanessa called for rescue immediately. She told them our location, though I'm not sure she fully understood where we were on the map. She told them about Howard and Curtis and Peggy and the things we had seen. I could hear the person on the other end of the line. They didn't believe her. They thought we were either lost hikers panicking or people playing some kind of elaborate prank. But they said they would send a search and rescue team, and they told us to stay put, so we waited. Jenna got progressively sicker. By evening, she was running a fever and barely conscious. The only medical supplies I could find were some basic first aid items and a bottle of aspirin, neither of which seemed to help. Vanessa sat by the radio, listening to the occasional check-ins from the rescue team. They were having trouble locating us. The coordinates we had given them were off. The terrain was difficult. It was getting dark, and they had decided to set up a base camp and resume their search in the morning. "They're coming," Vanessa told me. "They said they'll be here by noon tomorrow." But I didn't think we had until noon tomorrow. I didn't think any of us were going to survive the night. It started with the sounds, the circling sounds, the way it had circled us before. The creature was still out there, still hunting, still focused on us. I looked out the window of the ranger station and saw shadows moving in the forest. Not human shadows, too large, too fluid. "It's here," I said. Vanessa came to the window and looked out. She didn't say anything, but her hand found mine and squeezed it. Not hard, just enough to acknowledge that we were both seeing the same thing. Just enough to provide a moment of human connection in the face of something utterly inhuman. It circled the ranger station for the entire night. Not attacking, not trying to break in, just circling, testing, reminding us of its presence. Jenna lay on a cot in the back of the building, sweating through a fever that I thought might kill her before the creature ever got the chance to. And I sat with Vanessa, and we waited for dawn or rescue or something else entirely. Around 3 in the morning, I heard it do something it had never done before. I heard it climb. It scaled the outside of the ranger station, its claws making deep gouges in the wooden walls. We could hear it on the roof, could hear it dragging itself across the wooden shingles, could hear it testing the integrity of the structure, looking for ways inside. Vanessa grabbed a rifle that was hanging on the wall. I had no idea if it was loaded or if it would even work after years of disuse. But she pointed it at the ceiling and waited. The sound on the roof continued for about a minute. Then it stopped. The creature, whatever it was, seemed to have decided that the ranger station was too difficult to penetrate, at least from the roof. It left after that, moved away into the forest. We waited for it to circle back, but it didn't. The dawn eventually came, and with it, silence. By morning, Jenna was barely conscious. She had a fever of 104 degrees. Her skin was pale, and her breathing was shallow. I didn't think she was going to make it, but the rescue team arrived at around 10 o'clock. A helicopter landed in the clearing in front of the ranger station. Men in uniforms came out and approached the building cautiously, as if they expected the wilderness itself to attack them. Jenna was airlifted out first. She barely responded to their questions, barely seemed to understand what was happening. Vanessa and I were told to get in the helicopter as well, but she refused. "We're not leaving until we know about the others," she said. "Curtis and Peggy Bryant and Howard Powell, they're still up there somewhere." The rescue team leader, a man named Holloway, said they would do a grid search of the area. They would look for the others. But they needed us to come with them now. It was getting late, and they didn't want to risk flying in darkness. So Vanessa and I got in the helicopter. We flew up over the mountains, and I could see the terrain from above, the endless green forest, the ravines and ridges, the places where the canopy was so thick that nothing could penetrate it. And I remember thinking that Howard and Curtis and Peggy were down there somewhere, lost in that vast, hostile wilderness. And the thing that hunted them was down there too. The rescue operation was called off after 3 days. They found no trace of Curtis and Peggy or Howard Powell, no bodies, no equipment, no signs of where they might have gone or what might have happened to them. The official report said they had likely gotten lost during the second night and fallen into a ravine or suffered some other fatal accident. It was a common occurrence in the Appalachian Mountains. Every year people died up there, got lost, fell, didn't have the resources to survive an unexpected emergency. The report didn't mention the bones we had found, the ancient graves, the cabin covered with claw marks. It didn't mention Howard's decision to walk away from the group and into the darkness. It didn't mention the sounds or the circling or the thing that I knew was still out there, still hunting in the high country. When they asked me to give my official account of what happened, I decided not to tell them the truth. I told them about the hike, about Peggy getting sick, about getting lost in the terrain. I told them about the cabin and the bones, but I said they were probably remains from some old settlement. I said I thought Curtis and Peggy had gotten separated from us in the confusion, and that Howard must have gone to look for them. Nobody pushed back. Nobody wanted to hear about the sounds or the circling or the intelligence that seemed to guide the thing that hunted those mountains. Jenna had told them something similar, though she had been delirious for most of the rescue process and her account wasn't very coherent. I think, deep down, they knew that something was wrong with our story. But they didn't want to know the details. They didn't want to have to confront the possibility that there was something in the Appalachian Mountains that wasn't accounted for in any wildlife management system. something that didn't fit into the rational world they had constructed. So they accepted our story. Case closed. 3 missing hikers, probably dead, probably lost to the mountain the way it has lost countless others over the years. I haven't gone back to work since it happened. I put in my resignation letter 1 week after the rescue operation ended. I'm a ranger no longer. What happened to Jenna? She survived the fever. She recovered physically, but she won't talk about the hike. She wouldn't even testify at the official inquiry into what happened. The last time I saw her, she had moved out of the area. She didn't tell me where she was going, and I didn't ask. I think she was trying to get as far away from the Appalachian Mountains as she could possibly get. Vanessa was the only one who seemed to want to continue investigating. She hired private investigators. She requested copies of the ranger's logs and the historical records. She was determined to find evidence of what had really happened. But evidence of something that doesn't officially exist is hard to find. Without the proper authorization, without the backing of official agencies, it's just the ramblings of a woman convinced that something impossible happened to her in the wilderness. The last I heard, she had moved closer to the mountains. She had purchased land at the edge of the Appalachian National Forest. She has started going back to the same trails that we hiked that summer, though she doesn't go alone. She brings others with her. She collects their stories and their photographs. She documents everything. I think she's trying to prove that what happened was real. I think she's trying to convince the world that the mountain isn't safe, that something is still hunting up there, that more people need to know about it before it claims more victims. But I don't think she'll succeed. I don't think people want to know. I don't think they want to acknowledge that there are places in this country where human authority doesn't extend, places where the wilderness is still truly wild, places where things live that exist outside the boundaries of biology as we understand it. As for me, I still live in the area, though I no longer work in the mountains. I got a job at a supply store in town, doing inventory and helping customers. It keeps me busy. It keeps me in contact with other humans. It keeps me from spending too much time alone in my thoughts. But I still hear the sounds sometimes. Not in the mountains, but in my dreams. That low growl, that rhythmic breathing, that crooning sound that was almost music, but also fundamentally wrong. And I still think about Howard Powell and the choice he made to walk away from our group. I've read every story I can find about the Cherokee legends regarding the Black Devil. I've studied the historical records of missing people in the Appalachian Mountains, and I've come to believe that Howard understood something that the rest of us didn't. I think he knew, from his own experience 50 years ago, that there was no way to survive an encounter with the thing that lives in those mountains. I think he knew that the creature was intelligent enough to let some of us go while claiming others. I think he knew that sacrifice might be the only way to give the rest of us a chance, and I think he deliberately drew its attention to himself at that moment, allowing the rest of us to escape, because he had already paid the price that the mountains demanded. He had already lost someone. He had already lived with the knowledge that something inhuman existed in the world. He had spent his whole life carrying that burden. So he came back. He came back to the place where he had seen Daniel Foster disappear, and he made a deal with the thing that lived there. He offered himself in exchange for our lives. That's my theory, anyway. That's the only explanation I have that makes any kind of sense. But I could be wrong. Maybe Howard just had a death wish and decided to commit suicide by wilderness cryptid. Maybe Curtis and Peggy made it out of the mountains and are living somewhere, pretending that the hike never happened. Maybe Jenna is in some other state, living a normal life, successfully putting that experience behind her. But I don't think so. I think Curtis chose to stay with his wife as she got sicker, and I think she couldn't make it out. And I think that when the thing that hunts the mountains found them in those ancient ruins, they couldn't do anything to stop it. They didn't run. They didn't try to hide. They just accepted their fate, and that's a kind of courage I'm not sure I would have possessed. There's a part of me that wants to go back, wants to climb those trails again and look for evidence of what really happened, wants to find the cabin and the ancient ruins and the clearing where we found the bones, wants to understand more about the thing that hunted us. But I don't go back. I haven't been back to the mountains since the day I was airlifted out of that ranger station, and I don't think I will go back. Some knowledge is too heavy to carry. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. The Appalachian Mountains are vast and ancient and beautiful. They're also dangerous in ways that most people don't appreciate. They're dangerous because they're old. They're dangerous because they existed long before humans came to this continent, and they'll continue to exist long after we're gone. And they're dangerous because not everything that lives in them is bound by the rules of the natural world as we understand it. There are things up there that don't fit into any textbook, things that have been there for centuries, maybe longer. Things that hunt and think and remember, things that we're not supposed to know about. I'm telling this story because I need someone to know. I need it to exist outside of my own head. I need someone to read these words and understand that the wilderness is not a safe playground for those seeking adventure. It's not a place where human authority and human wisdom can protect you. The mountains don't care about your experience or your preparation or your confidence. The mountains are patient. The mountains remember. And the thing that lives in the high country, the thing they call the devil dog, it hunts on the mountain's behalf. It protects their secrets. It keeps people away from places where they're not supposed to be, and it chooses its victims carefully. That's the only explanation I have for why some of us lived and some of us didn't. That's the only way I can understand why Curtis and Peggy and Howard were claimed by the mountains, while Jenna and Vanessa and I were allowed to leave. We were supposed to tell this story. We were supposed to warn others. We were supposed to let the world know that there are places in this country that aren't safe. Places where the old stories are true. Places where the folklore is real. But nobody believes us. Nobody wants to believe us. I don't blame them. I wouldn't believe us either if I hadn't lived it. So I'm telling this story to whoever is listening. I'm telling it because I promised myself I would someday find a way to make people understand. And I'm telling it because I think someone else needs to know that if you hear strange sounds in the Appalachian wilderness, if you hear that low growl or that crooning music, you should leave immediately. Don't think about the trail ahead. Don't think about your planned destination. Don't think about being lost or the distance or the difficulty of getting out in the dark. Just run. Leave immediately. Get out of those mountains as fast as your legs can carry you, because something in those mountains is hunting, and it has been hunting for longer than recorded history. And it's very, very good at what it does. My name is Brett Carpenter. I was a park ranger in the Appalachian National Forest. And this is the true account of what happened to my group during a summer hiking expedition. This is the story that no one believes but everyone should hear. And if you go into the mountains, if you hear the sounds that I described, if you see evidence of something hunting you from the darkness, remember what I've told you. Remember that you're not really lost. Remember that you're exactly where that thing wants you to be. And remember that some of you will get out and some of you won't. That's just the price the mountains demand. My name is Alvin Jenkins. I am 68 years old. I have worked as a wilderness guide in Pennsylvania, Appalachia for 42 years. When people ask me now if I believe in things that hide in the deep forests, I tell them the truth without hesitation. I have seen what should not exist. I have watched it move through the trees. I have heard sounds that no animal recognized by science should be able to produce. This account concerns the summer of 2 years ago. It was July when 6 of us set out from the ranger station near McConnell's Mill. The expedition was planned as a 10-day expedition through the remote valleys and ridgelines of the Appalachian wilderness. We were to traverse territory that saw few visitors. The paths we would follow were old, some predating the formation of the state forest itself. Brooke Sanders was 38, a researcher who specialized in environmental systems. She had published papers on apex predator behavior in North American wilderness zones. Brooke was methodical, skeptical of folklore, and armed with 3 cameras and collection equipment. Norman Alexander was the oldest among us at 74. He was a retired wildlife specialist who had spent his life documenting animal migration patterns. Norman moved slower than the rest of us, but his knowledge of the territory was invaluable. Felicia Perry was 46 and worked as a documentary videographer. Her role was to film the expedition, to capture footage of the landscape and our team's observations. Daryl Russell was 59, a veteran outdoorsman who had worked in forestry management across 3 states. Irene Griffin, 65, was a naturalist and author who had written 7 books about Appalachian ecology and survival. I was the guide. The responsibility fell to me to navigate, to ensure our safety, and to make decisions about our camp locations and our route. We loaded our equipment at dawn. 6 backpacks, each carrying 10 days of food rations, water purification tablets, first aid supplies, camera equipment, and sleeping gear. The morning was clear and cool. The forecast called for fair weather through the 10th day. We were optimistic. The first 2 days went without incident. We moved through familiar terrain, descending into valleys where hemlocks grew so thick that the sunlight barely penetrated the canopy above us. The sound of the forest was normal. Birds sang, squirrels chattered. The understory rustled with small creatures going about their lives. Brooke collected plant samples. Norman identified animal tracks. Felicia filmed the landscape. Irene took notes in a leather journal. Daryl managed our pace, ensuring no one fell behind. On the evening of the third day, we made camp in a clearing near Slate Run. The clearing was perhaps 100 yards across, bordered on three sides by dense forest. The stream was reliable water. The ground was relatively level. A shelter structure still stood there, built decades earlier by the Forest Service. It provided framework for our tents. That night, I heard something that raised the hair on my neck. We had eaten dinner around 7 in the evening. We sat by a modest fire, enough to warm our bodies against the cooling air. The temperature had dropped to around 50 degrees Fahrenheit. It was pleasant, actually. Norman and Irene discussed the ecology of the hemlock forests. Brooke reviewed footage on her camera. Daryl cleaned his hiking boots. Felicia worked on planning shots for the following day. Around 9 o'clock, we began securing the camp. We stored our food in bear boxes. We arranged our tents in a loose semicircle around the shelter structure. We did everything according to protocol. I had done this hundreds of times. There was no sense of anything unusual. I was the last to retire to my tent. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the forest. This was something I had always done. The sounds of the wilderness at night told a story. Owls calling to one another, deer moving through the brush, the wind through the branches. These sounds were like an old language that I had learned to read years ago. Around midnight, I heard something different. It was a sound like no animal makes. I have heard bear vocalizations. I have heard mountain lions, though they are rare here. I have heard wolves in recordings, though they are not native to this region anymore. What I heard that night did not match any of these sounds. It was a long, low moan. It started at a frequency that was almost musical, almost mournful. Then it changed. It became something else. It became a sound like a person attempting to howl, but the anatomy producing the sound was all wrong. The pitch changed in ways human vocal cords should not allow. The sound came from the forest, to the north of our camp, perhaps 200 yards away. I lay still. I did not move. My breathing became shallow. I waited to hear the sound again. Seconds passed. The forest seemed to hold its breath as well. Then I heard movement. Not the light footstep of a deer. Not the shuffling of a raccoon. This was deliberate movement through the brush. Heavy movement. Slow movement. Something large was walking toward the camp. I unzipped my sleeping bag without making noise. I reached for the flashlight I always kept near my head. I did not turn it on. I sat in the darkness of my tent and listened. The movement stopped. Whatever it was had stopped moving. The forest was silent. Even the wind seemed to have ceased. The silence was more terrifying than the sound had been. I waited. I do not know how long I waited. Perhaps 3 minutes, perhaps 10. Time becomes strange when fear enters your body. My heart was beating hard enough that I thought it might shake the entire tent. Then I heard Daryl's voice from the shelter structure. He was calling out, asking if anyone else was awake, if anyone else had heard the sound. The tension in the camp broke immediately. Flashlights came on. People emerged from their tents. We gathered in the clearing, talking over one another, trying to make sense of what we had heard. Norman said it was likely a bear, perhaps a large male that had been wounded or was sick. Wildlife specialists often explained unusual sounds as the result of sick or injured animals behaving erratically. Brooke was more cautious. She pointed out that no known animal in this region should produce a vocalization like what we had heard. She suggested we review what we thought we knew about the local fauna. Perhaps, she offered, there was an animal we had not accounted for. Perhaps there was something large living in this forest that had not been formally documented. Irene said nothing. She stood at the edge of our circle, listening to the forest. There was an expression on her face that I had not seen before. It was not fear, it was recognition. It was the expression of someone who was confronting something they had previously thought to be mythology. I made the decision that we would stay awake for the rest of the night. I set up a watch rotation. 2 people awake at all times, 2-hour shifts. The 6 of us would maintain continuous vigilance until dawn. Felicia and Daryl took the first watch. I went back to my tent, but I did not sleep. I lay in my sleeping bag and listened to the forest through the tent fabric. Felicia and Daryl sat by the fire. They talked quietly, trying to maintain normalcy. The sound did not come again. When dawn arrived, the forest looked unchanged. The trees stood in their familiar places. The stream continued its gentle flow. The sun came up and painted the canopy in shades of amber and gold. It was beautiful. It was peaceful. In the morning light, the fear of the night seemed almost embarrassing. Norman apologized for sounding the alarm. Perhaps, he said, the sound had been a combination of natural wildlife noise and exhaustion playing tricks on our minds. We discussed whether we should abandon the expedition. We had satellite communication devices. We could contact the ranger station. We could arrange to be picked up, but no one wanted to leave. Each of us, for our own reasons, wanted to continue. Brooke wanted to gather more data. Norman wanted to prove there was nothing unusual about the sounds we had heard. Felicia wanted footage of the deep wilderness. Irene wanted to go deeper into the forest, not away from it. Daryl wanted to maintain his reputation as someone who did not flee from wilderness challenges. I agreed to continue. I told myself that one strange sound in the night was not enough reason to abandon the mission. I told myself I had overreacted. I told myself the forest was still the place I knew. I was lying to myself. We broke camp and moved northward, deeper into the wilderness. We followed a valley that descended gradually, following a tributary creek. The forest thickened around us. The trees grew older and larger. Some of the hemlocks must have been 300 years old, their trunks wider than a man could wrap his arms around. We made good progress. We covered nearly 12 miles by the time we stopped to make camp for the second night. We chose a location similar to the previous night's camp, a small clearing near water. Forest on all sides. No sign of anything unusual. As darkness fell, I felt the tension in our group increasing. We were quieter than we had been before. We ate dinner without the casual conversation of the first nights. We set up our tents with more care, positioning them closer together. We established watches again, not because of anything specific, but because we all felt better knowing that someone was watching the perimeter of our camp. On this second night, the sound came again. It came earlier this time, around 11 o'clock. It came from a different direction, from the east, closer to our camp than before. This time we all heard it. There was no doubt. This time we all recognized it for what it was. It was a call. It was an intentional vocalization, directed at us. It was a sound made by something that knew we were here. The second sound followed the first, then the third. Each call was slightly different. Each call seemed to be coming from a different location in the surrounding forest. Whatever was calling, there were multiple of them. Brooke, Daryl, and I went to the edge of the clearing, weapons in hand. Brooke carried a flare gun. Daryl had a large knife and a machete. I had a rifle, a practical choice for someone working in remote wilderness areas. We scanned the forest with our flashlights, trying to see into the darkness between the trees. We saw nothing. The light from our flashlights seemed to create more shadows than it revealed. The trees were dense enough that visibility was limited to perhaps 50 feet in any direction. Then we heard the footsteps, heavy footsteps, deliberate. Something very large was walking through the forest, approaching our camp. We heard the crack of branches under its weight. We heard the sound of vegetation being pushed aside. I raised the rifle. I aimed toward the sound. My hands were shaking. The footsteps stopped. They did not continue. They did not retreat. They simply ceased. Whatever had been walking toward us had stopped moving. In the silence that followed, we heard something that made the blood in my veins feel cold. We heard breathing. The sound of something breathing heavily, as though from exertion. The sound came from multiple points in the forest, not from one location. It was as though we were surrounded. It was as though multiple large animals were standing in the forest around us, waiting. I said we should get back to the tents. I said we should gather everyone together. We did. We assembled in the shelter structure, all 6 of us. We closed ourselves inside and waited for dawn, the rifle across my lap, the flare gun in Brooke's hands, the knife in Daryl's grip. Norman said we needed to leave. He said the expedition was over. He said we should activate the satellite device and request immediate extraction. I agreed with him. I had heard enough. Whatever was in the forest around us was not something we should encounter. It was not something that could be explained by wildlife migration or mating behavior or territorial disputes. It was something else, something wrong, something that should not exist. We tried to activate the satellite device. It did not work. The device showed an error message. The communication array might have been damaged. The batteries might have been depleted. There was no way to contact the ranger station. We were alone in the forest with something that hunted us. Irene said very little during that second night. She sat in the corner of the shelter structure, looking out toward the forest through a gap in the boards. She had a small leather journal in her hands, and she was writing in it. When I asked what she was doing, she did not answer. She continued writing until dawn broke and the forest went silent. With the first light of morning, the sounds stopped. The forest returned to normalcy. The birds sang again. The insects buzzed. The creek flowed as it always had. In the daylight, the fear of the night seemed less substantial, as though it had been the product of a collective nightmare rather than something real. But we knew better now. We knew that something was out there. We knew that it had intelligence. We knew that it was aware of us. We did not have much choice. We could not go backward without passing through miles of forest on our own. We could not stay here. We had to move forward and hope that whatever was hunting us would lose interest in our group. We had to hope that we could make it out of the wilderness alive. We packed our gear and began moving north again, following the valley. Our pace was faster now, faster than was safe, faster than was wise. But we moved with purpose, with the understanding that every mile we traveled in a specific direction was a mile closer to either escape or confrontation. On the fourth day of the expedition, I realized that we were being followed. This was not an assumption. This was not paranoia. I could see the evidence. We had stopped to rest near a small waterfall. The waterfall created a natural pool, perfect for refilling our water containers. As we were resting, Norman and I examined the soft ground near the pool. We found footprints. At first, I tried to convince myself that they were bear prints. The shape was wrong for that explanation. The prints were bipedal. They were made by something that walked upright on two legs. The footprints were large, perhaps 18 inches in length. There were 5 toes. The prints had been made within the last few hours. Norman looked at the prints for a long time without speaking. He looked at them the way an academic looks at a problem that contradicts everything they believe about their discipline. He was standing in front of evidence that challenged his worldview. He said, very quietly, that we needed to move. He said we needed to move quickly and continuously until we reached the northern boundary of the state forest. He said we could cover the remaining distance in 4 days if we pushed hard. Brooke asked why the footprints concerned us so much. Was it not simply an unknown animal? Was that not the entire purpose of her documentation work, to find unknown species? Norman said, very firmly, that finding an unknown species was different from having that species pursue us. He said that whatever had made these prints was not investigating us out of scientific curiosity. It was following us. It was trailing us like a hunter trails prey. Irene, who had been examining the prints as well, agreed with Norman. She said that the prints showed a pattern of deliberate pursuit. She said that the prints were positioned on either side of our own trail, as though something had been walking parallel to our group, keeping pace with us, watching us. Daryl suggested we ambush the creature. He said that if we set a trap, if we prepared a defensive position, we could confront it directly. He said that a direct confrontation might be better than fleeing. He said that fear created by uncertainty was worse than fear created by a known enemy. I told him no. I told him that confrontation was a last resort, not a first option. I told him that we did not know enough about this creature to engage it in combat. I told him that our goal was escape, not heroism. We moved. We moved quickly. We covered 16 miles that day, far more than I had planned. By evening, my feet were blistered. Norman was barely able to walk. Brooke was operating on pure adrenaline, her camera forgotten, her research abandoned. Felicia still attempted to film our surroundings, capturing footage of our trek, as though the documentary was still the priority. Irene moved effortlessly, tireless, as though this wild terrain was natural territory for her. As night fell, we made camp on a ridge overlooking a long valley. The location was less ideal than I would have preferred, but we were exhausted. We could not push farther. During our camp setup, I noticed something that should have alarmed us immediately. The footprints were there as well. They circled our camp location. They were recent. Whatever was following us had passed through this location while we were still several miles away. It had anticipated our route. It had known where we would come. I did not tell the others what I had found. I kept this information to myself. It seemed important not to panic the group further. It seemed important to maintain the illusion that we might still escape this situation. As darkness fell completely, we heard the sounds again. The long, low moans that seemed to come from a human throat that had been altered by something alien and wrong. The sounds came from multiple directions. The calls were almost rhythmic, as though the creatures were communicating with one another, coordinating, planning. Brooke finally asked the question that had been implicit in all of our thoughts since the first night. She asked if we were being hunted by Bigfoot. She said it plainly and directly, without any of the embarrassment or hesitation that such a question might normally produce. Irene responded. She said that Bigfoot was the popular term, but the creature was not a simple legend. She said that throughout North American history, there had been documented sightings of large bipedal creatures in wilderness areas. She said that most sightings could be explained as misidentified bears or exaggerations by witnesses, but not all. She said that there were regions where the sightings were too numerous, too consistent, too credible to be easily dismissed. She said that what we were facing might be one of these creatures. She said that if it was, then we were in genuine danger. She said that these creatures, if they existed, were intelligent enough to hunt and strategic enough to outmaneuver human opposition. Norman asked if Irene believed that such creatures were real. He asked if all her years of naturalist work had led her to such a conclusion. Irene said that she did not believe. She said that belief was for religion and philosophy. She said that she accepted evidence. She said that the evidence was mounting around us. She said that we would soon reach the point where denial would be impossible. Around midnight, we heard footsteps in the clearing. Not the footsteps of an animal. The footsteps of something walking upright. The footsteps were slow and deliberate. Something was walking through our camp, moving between our tents, investigating our location. I held the rifle, and I was terrified. I was terrified that I would need to use it. I was equally terrified that using it would be ineffective. Felicia screamed. The sound was involuntary, a pure expression of terror. The moment her scream left her mouth, I knew we had made a mistake. I knew that we had revealed our location, confirmed that we were aware of the creature's presence. The footsteps stopped. For a moment there was silence. Then we heard a sound like nothing any of us had ever experienced. It was a roar, but not a roar like a lion makes. It was a sound that started low and deep and built into a high-pitched shriek. It was rage and power and intelligence combined into a single vocalization. It was the sound of something that had been challenged. Then it charged. We heard it crashing through the forest toward our camp, the footsteps pounding against the earth with tremendous force. I fired the rifle twice in the direction of the sound, but I did not see what I was shooting at. The muzzle flashes illuminated the clearing for a fraction of a second, and I saw nothing but trees and darkness. The creature did not scream or call out. It simply changed direction and moved away from the camp, back toward the deeper forest. We heard it retreat through the brush, the sound of its passage slowly fading into the distance. We packed our entire camp in 15 minutes. We did not sleep. We did not wait for dawn. We gathered our equipment and we left that location, moving north by the light of our flashlights, moving through terrain that became increasingly difficult to traverse in the darkness. We walked for hours. We walked until my legs felt like they belonged to someone else. We walked until Norman had to be supported between Daryl and myself. We walked until dawn began to break. When the sun came up, we found a location that was defensible. It was a rocky outcrop, elevated above the surrounding terrain. There was a cave entrance, a natural shelter carved into the rocks. We made camp here. We would not move during the daylight hours. We would rest as much as we could and prepare ourselves for another night. Irene examined the area around the outcrop. She found more footprints. She found evidence that the creatures, and it was clear now that there were more than one, had been tracking us for miles. She found marks on trees where something large had leaned against them. She found areas where vegetation had been torn away. She brought this evidence to me, and she told me what she believed we were facing. She said that the creature we had encountered was not a typical Bigfoot of the kind described in folklore. She said that this creature was different. She said that its fur was white, or nearly white. She said that this variation, this albino or leucistic variant, was something that had never been formally documented. She said that in certain Native American traditions there were stories of a white creature that inhabited the high places. She said that the creature was described as more intelligent than its darker cousins. She said that it was described as more dangerous. She said that some traditions claimed that the white creature was not just an animal, but something that occupied a space between animal and human intelligence. She said that some traditions claimed it was a guardian, protecting the forest from those who would desecrate it. I asked Irene how many creatures we were facing. She did not know. She said the evidence suggested at least 3, possibly more. On the 5th day, we rested. We took turns sleeping in 4-hour increments. We rationed our food, calculating that we might be able to extend our supplies for 6 more days if we were careful. The cave provided shelter from the wind, and the rocky elevation provided visibility of our surroundings. Brooke attempted to repair the satellite communication device, but it was truly damaged. The circuitry was fried. Without that device, we had no way to contact the outside world. We were isolated in the wilderness with unknown creatures tracking our movements. As night fell on the 5th day, we heard the creatures again. They did not approach the rocky outcrop. They remained at a distance, calling to one another, their voices echoing through the valleys. But their presence was constant. They were there, they were waiting. Daryl suggested a plan. He said that early in the morning he would create a distraction. He said he would make noise in one direction, make it sound like he was moving through the forest in that direction. He said that this would draw the creatures' attention away from our main camp. He said that while the creatures were focused on the distraction, the rest of us should run. I told Daryl that his plan would result in his death. I told him that the creatures were intelligent enough to recognize a deception. I told him that running would not save us if the creatures wanted to catch us. Daryl said that he was offering himself so that the rest of us might escape. He said he was 65 years old. He said his life had value, but less value than the lives of people younger than him. He said that this was the math of survival. Norman argued against Daryl's plan. Irene was silent. Brooke looked like she was considering it, calculating the odds, evaluating the practical benefit of sacrificing one life to save 5. We did not implement Daryl's plan. Instead, we sat in the cave through the night, listening to the creatures' calls, waiting for dawn. On the 6th day, I made a decision. We could not continue north. The path ahead led into increasingly difficult terrain that would slow our movement further. The creatures had already proven they could track us, could anticipate our route, could match our pace. I proposed a different strategy. I said that we should climb. I said that we should ascend to the highest point in the immediate area and attempt to establish a fortified position. I said that at elevation, with solid rock beneath and around us, we might be able to defend ourselves more effectively. Norman asked if such a location even existed in this territory. I said that yes, there was a ridge approximately 4 miles to the west. It was steep terrain, difficult to climb, but if we could reach it before dark, we might be able to make our stand there. Irene agreed with this plan immediately. She said that elevation was important. She said that the creatures, whatever their intelligence level, were still adapted to the forest floor. She said that moving to high ground might disrupt their tactical advantage. We abandoned most of our remaining supplies. We kept only water, the rifle, a few climbing tools, and emergency rations. We needed mobility more than comfort. The hike to the ridge took nearly 10 hours. The terrain was steep. The forest gave way to rocky slopes. The air became thinner as we climbed. By the time we reached the ridge, we were all exhausted beyond measure. The ridge was perhaps 200 yards long and elevated about 3,000 feet above the valley floor. The view from the top was spectacular. We could see for miles in all directions. The forest rolled away beneath us in waves of green, interrupted by streams that glowed silver in the fading light. At the northern end of the ridge was a natural rock formation, a cluster of large boulders that had weathered and accumulated over geological ages. Between these boulders was a space, a natural fort of sorts. If we positioned ourselves correctly, we could defend this location against a much larger force. As darkness fell, we settled into the formation. We arranged rocks to create barriers. We positioned ourselves to cover all approach angles. I held the rifle and 2 spare magazines that I had been carrying since we left the initial camp. Daryl had the large knife and the machete. Everyone else had what small tools and improvised weapons we had been able to gather. The creatures came as night fell completely. We heard them ascending the ridge, heard the deliberate sound of their movements as they approached our position. They did not hide their approach this time. There was no attempt at stealth. They came directly toward our location, their footsteps heavy and deliberate. We heard the breathing. We heard the low vocalizations. There were at least 4 of them, perhaps 5. Their forms were indistinct in the darkness, but we could see them moving among the rocks, circling our position, testing the barriers we had erected. Brooke fired the flare gun. The bright illumination lit the ridge with sudden clarity, and we finally saw them. They were not anything like the descriptions in folklore. They were not the ape-like creatures described in Bigfoot legends. They were something different. They walked upright on 2 legs like men, but they were far larger than men. Their frames were 7 or 8 feet in height, covered in long white fur that seemed to absorb and reflect the flare light in an unsettling way. Their faces were broad and flat, with large eyes that were intelligent and aware. Their expression suggested understanding, intention, malice. The lead creature roared at the flare light, its lips pulling back to reveal teeth that were far too large for its head. The others echoed the roar, creating a sound that seemed to reverberate across the entire ridge. I fired the rifle. I aimed at the lead creature's center mass and fired. The shot connected. I saw the creature stagger backward, saw dark liquid that was not red but almost black spray across the white fur on its chest. The creature did not scream. It did not flee. It looked down at the wound as though curious, and then it looked up at me with an expression that was almost thoughtful. The other creatures moved forward, pressing against the rock barriers we had erected. The barriers held, but barely. These creatures possessed strength beyond anything I had anticipated. They tore at the rocks as though they were playing with toys. I fired again. The second shot struck the wounded creature in the shoulder. Again, it did not flee. It continued its slow, deliberate advance, ignoring the wound, unconcerned by the blood that was pouring from its body. Irene made a choice in that moment that changed everything. She stood up from behind our defensive position, and she walked forward, moving toward the lead creature with her hands raised and empty. Everyone was shouting at her to get back to the position, but she did not listen. She approached the wounded creature, and she did something that none of us expected. She spoke. She spoke in a language that was not English. It was not a language I recognized. It was something older, something that sounded like it originated from a time before modern civilization. She spoke it quietly, carefully, with clear pronunciation. The creatures stopped their assault. They stopped moving forward. They stood motionless, listening to Irene's words. Irene continued speaking for perhaps 2 minutes. Her words seemed to carry weight, seemed to carry significance. When she finished, she was silent. The lead creature, the one that had been shot twice, looked at Irene for a long moment. It made a sound, a low vocalization that was not a roar or a call, but something quieter and more complex. It was almost like words, but not quite human speech. The creature turned and walked away. The other creatures followed. They descended the ridge the same way they had come, their massive frames moving with an agility that should not have been possible for creatures of their size. We watched them disappear into the forest below. We waited for them to return, waited for them to circle back and continue their assault. But they did not return. As dawn broke on the 7th day, the forest was silent. The creatures were gone. Irene refused to explain what had transpired. She refused to tell us what she had said to the creatures or why they had chosen to withdraw. She simply returned to her position and sat in silence, looking out over the forest landscape. We waited on the ridge through that day and through the next night. No creatures appeared. On the 8th day, Irene announced that we could safely descend. She said that we were no longer in danger. She said that the creatures would not follow us anymore. We did not ask how she knew. We did not ask what arrangement she had made. We simply packed what few possessions we still had and began our descent toward the northern boundary of the forest. It took us 2 more days of hiking to reach the ranger station where we had begun. When we arrived, the ranger on duty looked shocked to see us. He said that we were 1 day ahead of our scheduled return. He said that everything appeared to be fine with us, though we looked exhausted. We did not correct him. We did not tell him about the creatures, about the white forms that had hunted us, about the ancient language that had saved our lives. What would have been the point? He would not have believed us. The expedition ended without formal reporting of incidents. Brooke eventually published a paper on animal vocalizations in remote wilderness areas, but she made no mention of the creatures or our experiences. Norman retired from his work as a wildlife specialist and moved to a house by the coast. He never returned to the Pennsylvania forests. Felicia had captured footage on her camera before it was damaged. She never used the footage. She told me that she did not want to remember what was on that camera. She wanted to forget the expedition entirely. Daryl told no one about what had happened. He maintained his reputation as a wilderness veteran, but I noticed that he never again ventured into deep forest. He remained in settled areas and developed towns for the rest of his life. Brooke continued her research, but she changed her focus. She began to study indigenous history and the documented traditions of Native American tribes. I saw her research eventually published in academic journals. The papers discussed the accuracy of historical accounts regarding large bipedal creatures in North American wilderness territories. She was attempting to legitimize the subject matter through scholarly rigor. Irene disappeared from public life for 2 years after the expedition. When she eventually resurfaced, she had changed. She was quieter. She wrote less frequently. She gave fewer lectures and interviews. She seemed to be carrying knowledge that weighed on her mind. I encountered her once, about a year after the expedition, in a library in Harrisburg. I asked her what she had said to the creatures on the ridge. I asked her what language it had been. She looked at me for a long time without answering. Then she said something that I have never forgotten. She said, The forest was here before us, Alvin. It was home to things older than our history. When we enter the forest, we enter territory that belongs to something else. The wise thing to do is remember that we are guests. The wise thing is to show respect. I asked her if the creatures were guardians, if they were protecting the forest as the tradition suggested. She said, maybe they were, maybe they are. Maybe every forest in North America has them. Maybe they are in other places too, in other continents, in other territories where humans think they are alone in the wilderness. Maybe they have been watching us for centuries, deciding when to reveal themselves and when to remain hidden. She left before I could ask any more questions. I never saw her again. I have thought about what she said many times in the years since. I have thought about the creatures and their apparent intelligence. I have thought about the possibility that there are things in the deep wilderness that we do not understand, things that exist beyond the scope of scientific documentation and formal classification. I continued my work as a wilderness guide for 5 more years after the expedition. I never ventured into the territory where the creatures had found us. I steered all future expeditions toward different regions, different valleys, different ridges. Eventually, I retired. I was 73 when I left the work. I was older than Norman had been during the expedition. I felt older still because of what I had experienced. Now I live on the edge of the forest, in a small house with a clear view of the trees. I watch the wilderness from a distance. I hear the sounds of the forest in the evening, and I listen carefully to identify each noise. Most are familiar, most are natural. Most can be explained by conventional understanding. But sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind is blowing in a particular direction, I hear something else. I hear a sound that is almost like a voice. I hear something that might be a roar, or might be something more complex. I hear the sound and my blood runs cold because I know what it is. The creatures are still out there. They are still in the deep wilderness. They are still hunting, and they are still watching. If you choose to go into the Appalachian wilderness, if you choose to venture into the deep forests of Pennsylvania, you should know what might be watching you from the darkness between the trees. You should know that there are things out there that science has not explained. You should know that the forest has its own laws, its own rules, its own inhabitants who were here long before we arrived. You should respect the forest. You should remember that you are a guest on land that belongs to something else. You should listen carefully to the sounds around you, because if you hear that long, low moan in the darkness, if you hear that voice that is not quite human and not quite animal, you will understand what I have learned. There are places in this world where humanity has no dominion. There are places where we do not belong. And there are things in those places that will make certain you remember that truth. The forest remembers everything. The forest keeps its secrets. And the forest protects what lives within it by any means necessary.